So my name is Judy Willcocks and I'm the head of Museum and Study Collection here at Central St Martin's. I'm also a research fellow. And this morning, although I do research with significant ethical considerations, because I do a lot of work through the museum around well-being, so I do quite a bit of work with people who've got mental health issues and doing interviews with them, but I'm not here today to talk about my research. I'm here to talk about practice and the ethics that you might encounter as a practitioner in the creative or cultural heritage sectors. And I've been working since 1997 in the museum sector, and I've done quite a lot of advocacy work through the Arts Council and through the Museums Association. And for about 5 years I sat on the Museums Association's Ethics Committee, and we were meeting regularly to discuss ethical issues that were being faced by museums in the UK today. So I wanted to start by thinking a little bit about the theory, and why not start with the dictionary definition of ethics. Ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity. So if you ever thought you were going to be able to avoid ethics in your working practices, you'll find that it's impossible, because if you are actors in the world, then you are going to encounter all sorts of ethical dilemmas. Ethical principles are the ideas and values that society holds dear. Now, in some respects, it would be really nice for us as practitioners if those were immutable and unchangeable. But because as a society we're always developing, ethical principles, what is acceptable and not acceptable to society, changes over time. And I know even in my lifetime, the way that we spoke and talked and thought growing up in the 70s and 80s is very different to the way people feel it's acceptable to behave today. And then ethical practice, that's what I'm here to think about today, or applied ethics. It's how you take those ethical ideas, those ethical principles, and apply them to your working life. So why are ethics important for the cultural heritage or creative sectors? Well, as actors in the world, we have agency, and so much of the activity that takes place in the cultural heritage sector or the creative industries is about working with people to have some kind of impact on them. Why would we be doing it? Why would we be making an artwork or curating an exhibition if it wasn't to have some kind of impact? And I really like that quote from Hilda Hine, that museums design exhibitions which affect how people think and what they value and what they do. So often we have an actual proactive ambition to change the way that people think about something. Responsibility has come up in presentations already, but in terms of thinking about the cultural heritage sector, many organisations are guardians of stuff, whether that's collections, content, land or buildings, and much of that stuff is held for the public, held in trust for the public, and or is publicly funded. So if you're in receipt of money from the public purse, then you're sort of beholden to behave in a particular way. And finally, accountability. So organisations not only try and impact the way people think and feel and act, they also sign up to ways of behaving. And a really good example of that is the museum and gallery sector, where we hold material in trust for the public and in perpetuity. And public trust is central to what we do in that world. So if, for example, a major donor, either financially or of artworks or objects, thought that a museum would then go and sell that material, they're not very likely to give it to you. It's only because we are places that have built up this public trust that we get people prepared to offer and support. So codes of ethics are particularly important for museums and galleries. We talked a little bit earlier on about the code of ethics that was developed post-Nuremberg trials for medical ethics. And actually there are very few comparative codes of ethics for other sectors. So social workers are bound by codes of ethics that are agreed by a sort of national standard, as is the medical profession. But in the UK, really the two codes of ethics that really apply to working in the cultural sector is the Museums Association Code of Ethics and the ICOM, that's the International Museums Code of Ethics. And both of those codes think about how we interact with our audiences, how we deal with the stuff in our care, and how we approach issues like financial issues. So Jamie was talking earlier about the law not necessarily being ethical, and a code of ethics is not a legally binding thing. And indeed, in many cases, the sort of codes of conduct that are outlined in codes of ethics require a behaviour which is higher almost than the law in terms of a sort of moral approach. And so they're not legally binding, but there is quite a lot of leverage in terms of the fact that funding bodies or accreditation bodies would expect to see you behaving within the confines of these codes of ethics. So the law doesn't say it, but it's quite hard to operate if you choose to operate outside those codes of ethics. So just a few, a very small number of the legislation that you might need to be aware of if you're operating in the cultural heritage sector, and this is by no means all of the legislation that may be useful or interesting, but all of this legislation is about, so it's about thinking about where your stuff comes from, provenance. Do you have the right to own it? Do you have the right to sell it? It's about keeping a check on that stuff as it moves around the world. So, a really good example of that is ivory is no longer seen to be an ethical thing to trade in. It's actually illegal to trade in. So there's international legislation that thinks about how that stuff moves around the world and how it can be policed. In this country, we've got the Human Tissue Act 2004. And again, that it's not meant to be something that prevents you from holding human tissue in your collections. It's meant to be a piece of legislation that makes you think about how you do that in a way which is ethical and morally right. And then in 2007 you've got the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that's so thinking about repatriation of cultural objects which have significance for Indigenous peoples is something I'll touch on at a later date. So there is more that I could have looked at in legislation. There's legislation about holding firearms in your collection. Obviously, we've got the recently revised Data Protection Act and what that means for archives, about the kind of information that you can hold. So there's all sorts of legislation that has an impact on how you operate. So I took the old 3R workshop and tried to think about truncating that and pulling out what maybe the key themes might be for the cultural heritage sectors. And I'm going to focus today on finance, sensitive content, representation, and cultural appropriation and repatriation. There is much more to discuss, but these four felt like they were fairly significant. So money is difficult in the, sorry guys, here you are in an art school. The creative and cultural heritage sectors are not known for being a place where money is plentiful. And if you're going to work in any kind of organisation, fundraise for it, if you're going to be any kind of senior manager in a cultural or arts organisation, you're going to spend a lot of your time thinking about where the money comes from, an awful lot of your time. When I was running an independent museum, I reckon about 80% of my time was spent looking at budget sheets, wondering how the hell I was going to make it work and trying to find other places to get money from. So the business model of most of those organisations is that you have revenue funding that pays for your day-to-day business, grants for capital projects, which tends to come from organisations like the Arts Council or the Heritage Lottery Fund, earned income, shop and cafe, legacies is big business now, trying to get people to leave you money when they pass away, low-level giving, so that's your membership. We have what we call the giving pyramid, right? So at the top, small numbers of donors who are giving big money, and at the bottom, lots of people who are forking out for membership and giving low-level donations. The two that are really problematic are at the top of the pyramid, the high-level givers, the private donors and the corporate sponsors. It's so difficult to think about where the money comes from, and I watch the press for interesting examples of things that we might talk about when we meet in class, and it feels like every day now I'm sending myself an email link to something that's been in the papers about where the money comes from. Should you have a list of people you just don't take money from? So I started out my career in the British Museum, and the first thing they said to us when we arrived was, we don't take money from the Al-Fayeds, so just don't even talk about it which is a shame, you know, because they had the Egyptian gallery or the Egyptian hall in Harrods, and it felt to me like they might be a good place to go to ask for money. But the British Museum was very much run through the British government, and the British government did not want any money to go to the Al Fayed family for whatever reason. So do you have a list of people that you don't take money from because the way they operate is so disconnected from your core values, or because they do something which is seen to be unethical? How much of an in does your sponsor get for giving you the money? Okay, so nobody's going to give you money if they don't get something back for it. You'll see all over London, on lecture theatres, on public spaces, on galleries, that there will be the names of people like the Weston family who've sponsored that. People give you money because they want to see some kind of representation in your space. But how far does that go? Do you let your sponsor have branding that's all over the building? Do you let a sponsor who's giving you a really considerable amount of money have a sort of brand presence that maybe even starts to overtake your own brand presence within your space? How do you address conflicts of interest? It happens all the time when there's money involved. So I added the BP logo at the bottom of this. We took money from BP when I worked in the British Museum. They were one of our major corporate partners. But oil companies have also been major sponsors of activity that takes place in the Science Museum. And indeed some activity around galleries that deal with climate change. And you have to ask yourself, you know, I was conflicted enough about taking oil company money when I worked at the British Museum, but if I was the Science Museum and talking about climate change, is it right to be taking money from organisations that we know are a core part of the problem? And how about a sponsor who wants to influence or dictate content? Right, this happens all the time, particularly with private donors. They think because they've come up with the cash that they then get to have some kind of conversation about what happens in the exhibition. And for me, this is an absolute no-go area. And of course, the way that you can deal with this is that in any kind of sponsorship agreement, you have an absolutely clear set of principles and a really clear outline of what the sponsor can and cannot do. And in fact, I put my hand up and say I left my last job because the Board of Trustees allowed a major donor to dictate the direction that the museum was going in, albeit for a temporary period of time. And I just felt so strongly that I didn't want to work for an organisation where we could be bribed by money. It wasn't a bad thing, right? We had to fundraise £500,000 to buy a painting I didn't think we should be buying. Nobody died, nobody was harmed, but I just felt really strongly that as a museum, as a public-facing, public-funded organisation, you have to have a sort of higher moral ground than that. So I've just pulled out a few of the examples I've been emailing to myself over recent weeks. So the Turner Prize, major sponsor, Stagecoach. Turns out the chair of Stagecoach is an anti-gay rights campaigner, and ultimately the sponsorship deal for the Turner Prize came to an end. So I began by talking about a little bit about the theory of ethics, the paperwork, the legislation, the codes of ethics, but I also said that the ethics are mutable, the ethical principles, what's acceptable and not acceptable, changes over time. And I think ethics in practice is a messy and sprawling business. And often what's happened in my career is that I've wound up in a situation where either two different ethical principles rub up against each other, and I can't make the solution fit both of them. Or when an ethical principle that you hold dear in your own heart rubs up against the awful reality of running a cash-strapped arts organisation in a world where funding is really, really hard to come by. There are all sorts of areas where it gets messy and different worlds collide with each other, and this is a really good example. So I've been in the position of fundraising. It's really, really difficult. You think you spend a great deal of time coaxing a donor, building up a package deal that works for them, wooing them into giving you money, all of the legal paperwork that surrounds it. And when you lose a major donor, it is crisis point for your organisation, and it can be the critical win or lose moment for a project or even for the long-term sustainability of an organisation. And so here, this is the archetypal situation where your ethical principles say no, We do not want to take money from somebody who's an open anti-gay rights campaigner, but then the practicalities of how you keep going if you don't take that money can be extremely complex. Here's another one. I mean, you would have to have not been looking at the press at all in the last 3 or 4 months to have missed this one. So the Sackler family have been massive donors for the arts in this country. And in London, the Sackler name is over the National Portrait Gallery, the Tate. They are just absolutely everywhere. And we worked with the Sacklers at the British Museum. And now, with a bit of digging, it's been identified that a pharmaceutical company from which the Sackler family have derived a great deal of money is really responsible for the opioid crisis that's ripping through the United States. Huge levels of addiction, painkiller addiction, lots of deaths, lots of ruined lives. And the artist Nan Goldin has been waging a very public campaign around whether or not organisations should be taking Sackler money. She feels absolutely definitely not. And really it's been a domino effect with project after project seeing money from the Sackler Foundation being taken back. So, you know, to be quite clear, my personal position is we should not be taking money from a family that's deriving money from a national crisis that's leading to mental health issues, physical dependency issues and deaths. We absolutely shouldn't. But it opens up a whole can of worms about where the money comes from, how deep we dig, where the money comes from. And if you start the ball rolling with a refusal to take money from the Sackler family, with a refusal to take money from Stagecoach because somebody involved in the organisation has deeply reprehensible views, where does it all end? And what does that mean for the arts? So Chris Frayling, former chairman of the Arts Council, says it's one of the iron rules of fundraising that you go to the people with the ruined reputation or the questionable background first, because they're the ones who really want to be rehabilitated. And if we start really digging too deep, where will all of this end and what damage will that do to the arts? So I hope you've all had a moment to read that article that was sent round with the information about this lecture. So it's just a newspaper article about the Sackler money with quotes from Chris Frayling, who's problematising it and saying maybe we shouldn't be too squeamish, and maybe if we say no to the Sackler Foundation, we shouldn't be digging too deep elsewhere. So I'd like you in pairs or groups of 3 just to spend 5 minutes talking about that. And we're not going to have time to hear you reporting back, but at the end of your conversation I just want a show of hands from the room about who thinks they would take the money anyway, and who thinks we absolutely shouldn't take the money. So if you can self-organise into pairs or groups of 3. Discussing, but can I just have a show of hands who would take the money?
Seriously?
Interesting. Okay. And who would not take the money? That's surprising. More people said they would take the money than I thought would say they would take the money. And what I would say is before I started to work, I had very strong ethical ideas and moral principles, and I would have said, no way would I take that money. And I say now I wouldn't take the money, but it's not me who's in the position of the person who's just lost £100,000 for a major redevelopment project. And I would say when you get more mired in the day-to-day stresses and strains of running an organisation, you start to think very differently. You start to be a bit more flexible, I think, and less dogmatic. So moving on to sensitive content. So I run a museum, always have, worked in museums, so I've got a lot of stuff, and I spend a lot of time thinking about how people encounter that stuff and what is safe and what is right and what is wrong. And I just pulled a few examples again that I've found in the press recently. So this was an article by Lynn Gardner about a production of an opera production of William Tell, in which somebody is raped on stage, and opera goers are notorious for being extremely conservative, and a number of people walked out of the performance. So it's thinking all the time about how much content you can present, how far you can go, and what your responsibilities are, both to artistic freedom and to the sensitivities of the people who are going to be encountering your performance or your stuff. And I think, you know, this is a particularly divisive issue. So there is a kind of modus operandi of thinking which says that we have creative freedom as makers, as artists, as curators, or as performers, and that as long as you advise people of what kind of content they might be expecting to see, you can do what you damn well like. And there's a bit of me that's really signed up to that. But then something like a representation of a physical attack is triggering, really triggering. And when somebody is in a confined space like an opera house, that's an incredibly strong piece of theatre to be presenting. And as often when I'm talking about ethical dilemmas, I don't know what the right and the wrong answer is, because two sort of conflicting beliefs are being held in tension. This is another one of my favourites, if favourite can be the right word. So Graham Ovenden is a convicted sex offender, and he was recently ordered by a court judge to destroy a number of items in his archive. So he is a painter and a photographer, and his sex offence is with underage females, and some of the material that he held in his archive was held to be indecent. So that is legislation, that is not morality, that is not ethics. That was a judge who, you know, there are different laws for representation of the body in photography and in terms of decency as there are in paintings, and so it was a number of photographs that he was ordered to destroy. And again, that tension for me, I cannot bear to think of children being abused, and if there are images in his art oeuvre that are drawn from children who are being abused, then that is a terrible thing, and he should not be able to share those or make money from them. I firmly believe that. But then I don't think I feel comfortable with a judge ordering that works of art be destroyed, because that is a slippery slope. And she was working within legislation. For her, there was a very clear right and wrong answer, and she had to do as a judge what she had to do. But I think if we start making moral judgments about artwork and dictating what can and cannot be kept, rather than restricting access to them, I think that's an extremely tricky thing. Glad to see a couple of the MACCC students here. If you do decide to show potentially offensive material, how do you manage that? So we've got real problems here in that we can do what we like in the building. You know, there will always be somebody naked at the degree shows. There'll always be something pornographic, but we put a wee note on the door that says, "Beware ye who enter here," and that is absolutely fine. But our window galleries open onto the public space, and we don't know who's going to encounter them. And interestingly, Argent, who manage that space and who tell us what we can and cannot show in there, usually cite that the problem is children. Children might encounter images in those windows that they would find distressing. Now, I am the mother of a small child, and I can tell you there is nothing about the human body they don't already know. If they want to have a look, they'll have a look. If they want to have a poke and a prod, they'll have a prod. I really actually don't believe it is children that are the problem. I suspect, I've been told that it's actually our wealthy neighbours who complain when they see things in the windows that they think is inappropriate. But here's a really elegant solution. So this is a quilt which was made from images from 1970s pornographic magazines showing women touching their bodies. And what a beautiful and elegant solution this was. So the quilt was shown back to front with just a gesture as to what the material might be. And I thought that was a really elegant way of dealing with the task at hand. Bury deep or acknowledge? This is the big question that is literally keeping me awake at night at the minute. So I run a handling collection. That means that I'm getting objects out of the museum stores all the time. I think I know my collection pretty well, but things surface at moments when I don't expect it. And some of the stuff we have in the collection is ugly, really ugly. So I want to distance myself from it. It wasn't collected by us, the institution as we are today. It wasn't made in the time that we're operating in, but that doesn't excuse the content, and it does not undo the violence that an encounter with that content can be for students who stumble upon it in the archive today. So there is much worse, but I chose not to show the stuff that's much worse in a slide in a lecture theatre, because I want to avoid the violence that can be done by encountering, for example, some of the language or some of the imagery that's in the archive. But here's a really good example. So this is from a book, a pattern book made in the 1850s. It's a very beautiful thing done by a man called Owen Jones, who goes around the world and picks little bits of Byzantine art or Egyptian patterning or Persian. And then we come to the work of the African subcontinent, and it's described as the work of savage tribes. And I pulled this out in a session. I'd never seen this page before. I hadn't gone through the book page by page. We opened it, and for the first time, and I was with a student who was Black African, and who was, it was like she'd been physically affected by the book. So bury deep or acknowledge. Do we make a list of stuff that's offensive and put it on the we don't ever get that out list? Or do we talk about it and acknowledge it? And something I really want to do as a white middle-aged curator working with quite a Western collection is to find a way of talking about this stuff which acknowledges it and takes responsibility for it, and gives me a sort of language and a confidence to address some of this stuff when it arises. So at the minute we're working with Shades of Noir, who are a university allied group who work to support students of colour and students who feel othered for a variety of reasons. And we're working with a tutor, and we'll be recruiting students to do some workshops with us in the autumn so that we can face up to some of this stuff and think about exhibiting it and think about really engaging with that colonial past and the way it impacts on our work today. So I've mentioned before that ethics are mutable, that things change and things can turn on a knife point very, very quickly. So you have to risk assess your collection constantly. So we collect work that relates to the Central St Martin story. We've got material in the collection by John Galliano. It's got a beautiful story attached. He's one of our big names. We get it out and talk about it all the time. He was always lauded as being almost this kind of godlike figure in the fashion world, and then suddenly he is filmed by two women in a bar in Paris having a really anti-Semitic, really unpleasant anti-Semitic rant. And so suddenly we have to think about the connection between his personal opinions and the material that we have in the archive, and the fact that people coming into the archive might be associating the stuff with the opinions. And you know, we had to make the choice: do we bury the article? Do we not get it out anymore, or do we get it out and talk about what that represents? And so we do get it out and we do talk about it. And I've had brilliant conversations with them. So I've had Jewish students saying, I still think he's a great designer. I've had students of other faiths and cultures saying, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole now because I'm working in solidarity with others. Michael Jackson is another prime example. We've got some material that relates to Michael Jackson. One week it's kind of okay. The next week it's maybe a place that you really don't want to go. So you have to be risk assessing all the time. Representation, I'm going to start talking really fast now, so forgive me, but I've got just another 2 sections to get through. So representation is a big issue. We all talk about the canon, white, Western, largely male. We know in this college and in this university that we need to really work on our curriculum to try and make them less that way inclined and much more embracing of other cultures. And here is an artwork made by the Guerrilla Girls, who are trying to address the underrepresentation of women in the art world. So the figures vary from country to country, but between America and the Western world, you're probably looking at something like 55 to 60% of women in art schools, maybe 30 to 35% women represented in galleries. And in America, female artists are earning 80 cents for every dollar that their male counterparts are earning. So we have to think when we're collecting, when we're showing work, when we're teaching, when we're putting together the curriculum, whether we are really engaging with content that represents the diversity of our audiences. this is a beautiful project. So we talk a lot in the archive world. We keep everything. We don't collect a bunch of stuff one year and then get rid of it the next. And part of the beauty of that is that it allows people to dip into the back catalogue and tell stories that have been forgotten. So actually for people of other colour, for LGBT+, for veterans returning from the Vietnam War, it was that capacity to dip into the archive and tell stories that weren't being told, or that had been forgotten, or that had been obscured, which I think is where the archive can be a really powerful political tool. And this was a lovely project done by Sonia Boyce, who's working from Chelsea College of Art. So she did a whole project on black arts and modernism, and that project dipped into collections across the UK and pulled out work by artists of colour and really tried to, not replace it in the canon, because it was never in the canon, but to really insert it into the canon where it should always have been. And so that's where I think that collecting policy, that collecting for all time, can be a really powerful tool for making a space for other stories to be told. And when it works well, it works brilliantly. This is the Women of the World Festival at the South Bank Centre. So this highly influential annual festival which celebrates women makers, women performers. And here is the Museum of Transology in Brighton, which is a space, which is, another space which is seeking to represent an underrepresented community. But let's not pretend that everything in the garden is rosy, because it is not. We are trying really hard, but museums and galleries in this country and cultural organisations are predominantly run by white people. We know that our visitor base is skewed more towards white audiences than if you think about the general makeup of the population. We're working really hard to change the content of our exhibitions, the way that we collect. So for example, this year the museum's window gallery display policy is all about working with people from other cultures and celebrating other cultures, or addressing some of the ugly stuff that we have in the collection from our colonial past. And we also this year, when we collect at the degree shows, I've asked and had positive response from the senior management team that we will be proactively collecting work by students of colour. So we can make these gestures that move us in the right direction, but actually systemically we know that there are all sorts of deeper problems, not just in terms of the way we collected in the past, but in the way that we conceptualise material. So we have a special edition of the university journal, Spark, which is coming out very soon. And in Spark, quite a number of people, librarians, museum curators, archivists, were talking about how the very structures of our collections description, which are all part of sort of agreed international standards, can help to replicate the inequalities of society in the museum or archive context. So for example, the Dewey library classification system has got some pretty unpleasant classifications in there. I know that I'm working in a collection where we have quite a rich Southeast Asian collection of material that was collected in the 1800s, and our historical cataloguing system is to call that Oriental antiquities, if you like. And the British Museum has reclassified all those traditional ways of talking about things, and now that the British Museum have got rid of their Oriental Antiquities department, they talk about Korean art or Southeast Asian art, and I feel like that's something about our systemic way of thinking that we maybe need to tackle here. Finally, cultural appropriation. So when I was on the ethics committee, repatriation. So cultural appropriation is the soft end. Repatriation of actual stuff is the hard end of this continuum. And when I was on the ethics committee, this is one of the things that we talked about most. So we'll start at the soft end. Here's Marks and Spencer's, who recently got into a lot of trouble because they, I say trouble, wasn't legal trouble, they didn't get fined, but they got a lot of kickback because they introduced a vegan biryani wrap, and a lot of Indian chefs and people who care about Indian food responded very strongly by saying, A, no, biryani is a dish which is served with rice, it doesn't come in a bread roll, and B, a biryani is traditionally a fish or meat dish, so the whole notion of this kind of bastardized sweet potato spicy thing that comes in a sandwich couldn't be further away from what they culturally believe to be a biryani. So, no one died. It wasn't the end of the world, and that is very much the soft end of cultural appropriation. Now, interestingly, cultural appropriation is usually conceived of as a Western power, a colonising power going in and taking cultural assets or using cultural assets from a country or a people that have been colonised. This, I thought, was a really interesting example because this is a sort of a fight around cultural appropriation between two Indigenous groups in the Americas. So an Inuit singer at a folk singing festival came out and cut ties with another Indigenous American performer because they were using throat singing, which is an Inuit, a very ancient Inuit tradition, in a way that she believed was inappropriate. So this is really interesting because now we have one Indigenous group really fighting against the cultural appropriation by another Indigenous group. But in reading this article, there was just so much going on under the skin because there was something quite paternalistic about the tone of the article, and it was almost like the article was saying, oh, look at these Indigenous peoples fighting it out amongst themselves. Why aren't they? That for me, there was a sense of the article saying, why aren't they sort of sticking up for one another as two people that have been colonised? And for me, there were just so many layers of ethical complexities in that discussion. And so that's about the cultural appropriation of concepts or processes. But what we dealt with most when I was working on the ethics committee was requests for actual stuff to be returned to what we would describe as source communities. So it all kicked off a while back with the return of the Lesotho ghost dance costume. This was the first repatriation of an object from the UK back to a source community. So it was taken from a survivor at the Battle of the Wounded Knee and then bought from the Wild Will Buffalo Show by the Glasgow Kelvin Grove Museum, and it was on display there for years until somebody from that source community visited and was completely horrified because the ghost dance costume has spiritual significance. The wearer of the ghost dance costume believes that when they go into battle they cannot be harmed, and of course at the Battle of the Wounded Knee those people were encountering Western industrialised warfare, so they were mown down by gunfire, and the source community made a request to get that item back. And at that stage, the museum community and Glasgow Council said, no way. But actually then they had a big think about it and they thought, this is really interesting because we want to attract audiences who are very diverse. We want to be seen to be representing our local communities. Why wouldn't we want to work in a flexible way with communities from overseas as well? And in the end, the council sent back the ghost dance costume, and a survivor from the tribe who was involved in that particular battle made a sort of ghost dance costume that they were able to display in its place. And that started a landslide, an absolute landslide. And I'm going to talk, as I'm going to give myself another 2 minutes, so I'll be really quick. This is something that made me really think about your own personal viewpoint and where your ethical considerations begin and end. So I signed off lots of repatriation requests. Yes, brilliant. Give the Jewish community back their candlesticks that are in the museum. Give back the Aboriginal material to the source community. And then we had a Druid who wanted to take back some human remains from a museum in the West Country, and I said, well, no, because Druidism isn't a real religion, right? It's a Victorian construct. Ancient Druids didn't really exist. It's this kind of modern hippie thing. And I had to really check myself then, because who am I to say? So yes, as a historian, I can tell you Druidism really was a construct of the Victorian period. But then who am I to say which source community gets to ask for something back? And with all of these things, the reason ethics pose such a dilemma is because it's a slippery slope. If we say no to the Sackler money, where do we end? If we say yes to the repatriation of the Maori remains, how far does that go? And I think it's when we were working with the ethics committee, we were always aware that we were at the top of a slippery slope. Very interestingly, recently, is it partly because we've got a Conservative government rather than a Labour government? I don't know. But suddenly we've now got Jeremy Wright, the Culture Secretary, saying no more repatriation. I feel very, very weird about that. That made me feel deeply uncomfortable. So I'm going to end. This is the ultimate repatriation question. Do we, don't we send back the Elgin Marbles? They've been here since the beginning of the 1800s, taken from Greece under very dubious circumstances, but once something has become part of the cultural imagination of a country after 200 plus years of something being here, it becomes very difficult for us to think about that going back. That was the second thing they said to us when we joined the British Museum. A, don't take money from the Alphayads. B, don't talk to anybody about the Elgin Marbles, and we're not giving them back. And there are, the Greek government's built this beautiful museum in Athens, and they're waiting, but I'm not entirely sure they're ever going to be lucky. So thank you, that's my email address. As I mentioned at the beginning, as well as doing all this museum work, I'm also a researcher doing a lot of work around well-being, working with mental health patients. So Jamie probably signed off my ethics application for doing semi-structured interviews with them. So if you've got any questions around any of this stuff, please, I'm really into ethics, so please feel free to drop me a line.